I used to think love was the kind of thing that grew stronger with time, that a marriage, after a decade, would feel like a tree with roots too deep to ever move. But sometimes roots don't mean life, they just mean you're stuck. That's how I felt in my marriage to Ethan. It wasn't that he was cruel or even unkind. He was steady, dependable, the type of man anyone would say was a good husband. But somewhere between his late nights at work and my silence at the dinner table, something invisible started growing between us. A distance I couldn't cross, no matter how many times I tried. The mornings always looked the same. Ethan's alarm went off before the sun rose, and he'd move through the house in half-darkness, already dressed in his pressed shirt and tie before I'd managed to open my eyes. He kissed me quickly, on the forehead more than the lips, and slipped out the door with his laptop bag in one hand and his phone in the other. By the time I shuffled into the kitchen, the coffee was already cold. His mug was in the sink, his chair empty. And so was I. We still sat at the same table each night, but there was no sound between us except the scrape of a fork, the clink of glass. He'd scroll through emails, glance at some chart on his phone, mutter a distracted MHM whenever I spoke. Sometimes, I didn't even bother to try. I'd just watch him, the man I once couldn't stop talking to, the man whose smile had once lit up entire rooms, and wonder when he'd stop seeing me. Or maybe the harder truth, when I'd stop being worth looking at. It's a strange kind of loneliness, to share a home with someone you promised forever to, and feel invisible inside of it. I found myself replaying memories of when we were younger, when Ethan used to drive across town just to bring me flowers, when he'd call me in the middle of the day just to say he missed me. Those gestures had evaporated over the years, leaving me with a version of him who seemed more like a roommate than a lover. One Thursday afternoon, I found myself in the small bookstore down the street, the kind of place that smelled of old pages and quiet. I wasn't looking for anything, really. I just wanted to be somewhere that felt softer than my own house. That's where I first saw him. Adrian. He was standing in the corner, flipping through a novel I loved but hadn't read in years. He looked up, caught my eye, and smiled in a way that felt disarmingly direct. "Is that one worth it?" he asked, holding up the book. I should have just nodded and walked away. That would have been the right thing to do. But instead, I found myself telling him why I loved it, the way the story lingered in your chest long after the last page. He listened. Not politely, not distractedly, but really listened. And in that moment, I realized how long it had been since someone had looked at me like my words mattered. We bumped into each other again the next week, then the week after that. At first it felt like coincidence, but eventually, I stopped pretending I didn't hope to see him there. Adrian had this way of making conversation effortless, of asking questions that pulled pieces of me out I'd forgotten existed. Where Ethan's eyes always seemed locked on a glowing screen, Adrian's eyes never left mine. I kept telling myself it was harmless. Just talking. Just a little reminder that I was still seen. But late at night, lying in bed beside Ethan's steady breathing, I caught myself replaying Adrian's smile, the way he leaned closer as if my words were secrets worth holding. And guilt burned in my chest. Still, I couldn't stop. I told myself I was only filling the silence Ethan had left behind. I told myself it wasn't dangerous. But every time I answered Adrian's questions with more of myself, I felt the ground shifting beneath me. A part of me whispered to walk away, to go home, to remember the vows I'd made. But another part, one that had been starving for years, leaned closer instead. I should have known then. I should have recognized the way my heart raced when I thought of him, the way the air felt charged when he stood near me. That was the beginning. That was the moment I should have turned back. But I didn't. I was already too deep, and I didn't even realize it. The first message came on a Tuesday evening. I was standing at the sink, rinsing the plates from dinner, when my phone buzzed. It was Adrian. Just a simple line. "I'm reading that book you recommended. You were right, it lingers." I stared at the screen longer than I should have. Ethan was in the living room, his eyes fixed on the glow of his laptop, the sound of keys clicking filling the silence. I could have ignored it, could have set my phone down and let it end there. But I didn't. My fingers hovered, then typed back. "Told you. It's one of my favorites." That was how it started, harmless, or at least that's how I justified it. But harmless things have a way of growing teeth. One message turned into two, two turned into nights of conversations that stretched past midnight. He asked about the books I loved, the dreams I'd given up on, the music that made me cry. And I told him. I told him things I hadn't said out loud in years. With Ethan, words bounced off walls and died in the silence. With Adrian, they bloomed. The first time we met outside the bookstore, it felt like a coincidence we both agreed to let happen. A coffee shop a few blocks away, neutral ground. I told myself I was only going to prove to myself it was nothing, that the chemistry I imagined would dissolve in the daylight. But when he walked in, when his eyes lit up at the sight of me, I knew I'd been lying. The moment stretched longer than it should have, and I felt the world narrow down to the space between us. We talked, we laughed, and when his hand brushed mine across the table, a shock ran up my arms so strong I almost pulled away. Almost. But instead, I left my hand there, just close enough to let him graze my fingers again. It was such a small betrayal, one Ethan would never know, but it felt enormous inside me. A week later, I kissed him. It wasn't planned. We were saying goodbye outside the cafe, the kind of lingering goodbye that already lasted too long. He leaned in slightly, and I should have stepped back. But my body betrayed me before my mind had the chance. His lips touched mine, soft and searching, and I didn't stop him. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he could hear it. The kiss lasted seconds, but when it ended, guilt rushed in like a wave. I drove home with my hands trembling on the wheel, staring at the ring on my finger, whispering to myself that it couldn't happen again. But it did. And again after that. Each time I promised myself it would be the last. Each time I believed the lie a little less. With Ethan, life was predictable. Quiet dinners, muted conversations, a man who fell asleep before I'd even turned out the light. With Adrian, everything was charged, electric. He made me laugh until my cheeks hurt, made me feel like the world hadn't passed me by, like I was still someone worth noticing. And though the guilt never left, though it sat in the pit of my stomach like a stone, the hunger for that feeling was stronger. I became an expert in hiding, deleting messages, rehearsing excuses, smiling at Ethan like nothing had changed. He barely noticed. Or maybe he didn't want to see. Some nights I looked at him and wondered if he could feel it, the betrayal lying right there between us, like a shadow stretching across our bed. But if he did, he never said a word. Adrian began wanting more. More time, more of me. He'd ask what I was doing on the weekends, why I couldn't stay longer. I reminded him I had a husband, a life I couldn't just leave. He'd smile at that, a little sad, a little frustrated, but he never pressed too hard. Not then. Still, I felt the tension building, like a rope pulled too tight. I told myself it was only about being seen, being heard, that I wasn't falling for him, that I still loved Ethan, in some fractured way. But late at night, when Adrian's words echoed in my head instead of my husband's, I knew the truth. I was already falling, and the ground was nowhere in sight. Every secret, every lie, was another stone tied to my ankle. And I was sinking. I knew it. I felt it. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Because for the first time in years, I felt alive. And I wasn't ready to let that go. Ethan started noticing before I was ready to admit it. It wasn't anything obvious at first. Just the way he'd glance at me across the dinner table, his fork paused midair, his eyes lingering longer than they used to. He asked once if everything was okay. I told him yes, of course, and he nodded like he believed me. But I knew he didn't. There was a shift in the air between us, one I couldn't control anymore. The nights became harder to balance. Adrian wanted more of me, more than stolen hours at coffee shops or hurried goodbyes in dark parking lots. He wanted weekends, mornings, time that belonged to Ethan. I can't keep being the secret, he said one night, his voice low but heavy. Don't you want more than this? I opened my mouth to answer, but the truth sat in my chest like glass. Yes, I wanted more. No, I couldn't have it. The life I'd built with Ethan wasn't something I could just walk away from, not without tearing everything apart. Yet with every message, every touch, I was already doing the tearing piece by piece. Ethan began working from home more often. At first, I thought it was coincidence. But the way his eyes followed me, the way he closed his laptop whenever I walked into the room, it was suspicion, not chance. One evening, as I was washing dishes, I caught his reflection in the window. He was standing in the doorway, silent, watching me. My chest tightened.
What?
I asked, trying to make my voice steady. He only shook his head and walked away. The discovery came on a Sunday. My phone, left charging on the nightstand, lit up with Adrian's name. I wasn't fast enough. Ethan picked it up before I could reach it, his face pale as he read the message glowing on the screen. "I can't stop thinking about you." The silence that followed was louder than any shouting could have been. He placed the phone back down slowly, like it burned his hand. When he finally looked at me, his eyes weren't angry. They were empty. That emptiness cut deeper than rage ever could. I tried to explain. Words tumbled out, about loneliness, about feeling invisible, about how I never meant for it to go so far. Ethan listened, or maybe he didn't. He stood there, arms crossed, his face unreadable. When I finally stopped, when I had nothing left to say, he asked only one question. Why him? I had no answer.
Because it wasn't really about Adrian.
It was about me, about the hollow inside I'd been trying to fill. But how could I say that without breaking him even more? The days that followed blurred together. Ethan moved through the house like a ghost, polite but distant, speaking only when necessary. At night, he turned his back to me in bed, a wall of silence I couldn't climb. Adrian kept calling, kept asking what would happen next, but I didn't know anymore. The thrill that once felt intoxicating now tasted bitter. One afternoon, I met Adrian in the same bookstore where it had all begun. His smile was softer this time, tinged with something like resignation. "You can't stay in between forever," he told me. His hand brushed mine on the counter, but instead of sparks, all I felt was weight. Heavy, suffocating weight. I wanted to tell him I loved him, but the words wouldn't come. Because it wasn't love. Not really. It was escape, it was oxygen when I was drowning. But now it was drowning me too. I walked out without saying goodbye, the bell above the door echoing like an ending. Back home, Ethan was in the kitchen, staring at the floor like he'd been standing there for hours. I opened my mouth, but he didn't let me speak. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said quietly. And then he left the room. That was worse than shouting, worse than slamming doors. Forgiveness was a bridge, but he wasn't sure if he wanted to build it. I sat alone at the table that night, staring at the empty chair across from me. The silence pressed down so heavy it was hard to breathe. I thought about the vows I had spoken years ago, about the promises I had broken piece by piece. I thought about Adrian's smile, Ethan's eyes, and the person I had become somewhere between them. In the end, there was no neat closure, no clean ending. Just the wreckage of choices I couldn't take back. I had wanted to be seen, to be heard, to feel alive. But in chasing that, I had lost something that mattered far more. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling while Ethan slept beside me with his back turned, I whispered to myself the truth I couldn't escape. I was too deep already. And still I said more.